I attended an artist lecture a number of years ago, and it was by a prominent glass artist whose work I really respect and admire. And at the end of the lecture, the host and the artist kind of sat down for some questions, and a young student stood up and asked the question, "What is the difference between art and craft?" And the audience moaned. No one wanted to hear the question. It's one of those questions everyone wants to know the answer to but doesn't ask. The host quickly stood up and recommended that the student read this book or that, and that the question was too big to tackle during the 30 minutes allotted for questions. So I decided right then and there that if I were giving an artist lecture and someone asked me that question, I should have a pretty straightforward answer that's based on experience. So I went home and I bought those books that she recommended that I read. And what I came up with was this, that art depends on craft, and craft depends only on itself. So that is to say that artists employ craft to execute artworks, and craftspeople make objects honestly with no sort of intention to transcend them into anything other than craft. So a lot of my work and research still tries to answer this question much more completely. Okay, so most university glass programs in the last 10 to 15 years have placed a really great emphasis on using glass as a material to create contemporary sculpture. And while that has resulted in some very impressive works of art, it has also resulted in a certain amount of de-skilling. And in my mind, it's a very narrow-minded view of what's possible with the material. And it seems like there's only a certain amount of making that's acceptable within this art school environment. Students who are interested in the technical side of glass making, and specifically glass blowing, usually end up making production design such as this and sell it at craft fairs. Or they become technicians who are employed to execute the designs of other people. And this is sort of the traditional factory situation where there's an artist or designer and a craftsperson. There's no real dialogue in most material-specific craft-based programs about issues in contemporary design. Those conversations are usually had within industrial design programs or architecture school. And I think that because of this, somewhere along the way, design became fundamentally confused with decoration. I would like to change that and offer another outcome, because makers and craftspeople have some real advantages when we're developing these designs. We can combine the deep knowledge of material and production processes with the conceptual framework of a sculptor and contribute to design in different ways. After my undergraduate work, I felt very disconnected with the earlier traditions of studio glass. I was familiar with the studio glass movement of the 1960s, which was that moment in the United States when a small group of artists decided to liberate glass from the factories and use it to make art. But earlier traditions remained a mystery to me, and I was very skeptical of this sort of very romantic story of studio glass in the United States. For me, it was in the factories of Europe and Scandinavia where that story really began, and I wanted to forge a real connection with that so that I could speak about my beliefs through actual experience. I started with the liberal arts degree, and that gave me the cultural information and inspiration, but I began developing a specific interest in reinventing and rejuvenating the relationship between art and industry. And so I decided to spend a dedicated amount of time in a traditional factory apprenticeship to gain further awareness of these issues of art and industry, design, and making in the real world environment. So I started this at the Simon Pierce factory in Vermont, and here I worked with glassmakers from the Czech Republic, from Sweden, from Russia, and it really sort of confirmed in me this need to have a real connection with that industrial history of glass. So after that, I went to work at the Steuben Glass factory in Corning, New York, which has long been considered the final word in quality and craftsmanship. It's long been presented as the gift for heads of state, and it has attracted the design talents of artists such as Salvador Dali and more recently Kiki Smith. So I spent 4 years there working my way through the system, and I was trained to be a good gaffer. Gaffer is sort of the team leader, by men and women who had had that title for 30 years. So the company, despite its efforts to sort of reinvent itself, ended up closing after more than 100 years of operation. And they couldn't reinvent themselves fast enough. They couldn't adapt to the new generation of glass collectors who are more interested in the glass that's on their phones or televisions than a glass fish or a glass bird. And this was, again, the traditional factory arrangement where the glass makers executed other people's designs, and this was the norm. I found it a little strange that the best glass makers in the world had little or no design input, or that the designers that came into the factory had absolutely no experience with glass. So there was always a really steep learning curve that ate up a lot of development time working through these designs. So the shop closed. This is Steve Bertrand and Chris Rochelle, two of the best. And we were a union shop, and there's always a lot of discussion about union labor and the high labor costs of making things in America. This is the Pontiac Aztek. So this is also sort of an example of a discussion about high labor costs in America. But the point here is that the union workers did not design this car, which is arguably the death rattle of an American automobile brand. It's sort of the result of when design falls apart and the direction becomes misguided. During my master's degree, I spent a lot of time trying to reinvent or rejuvenate that factory that I sort of wanted to exist in my mind. And I did a lot of installation works that dealt with that. But what ended up happening was I was making artwork about design rather than just making design, because I was in a sculpture program and that's what was expected of me. Until about a year ago, it dawned on me that instead of sort of making art about design, that I could just make design and be honest about it and try and address these issues of craftsmanship, labor, factory situations in the real world. So this is the first prototype of Urania, and this piece is made entirely by hand. It was prototyped here at Ball State University, and once I sort of decided to just go headlong into design, it became fun again, and the work felt honest for the first time in a number of years. And then I got really lucky. So after this piece had been picked up by Design Blog, across the ocean in Copenhagen, Denmark, a 185-year-old glass company called Holmegaard decided they needed something in their line that was fundamentally new. And they had a new creative director who was charged with sort of sending the company into the next 150 years. So I had found that sort of glass factory that I'd been looking for. This piece is entirely made by hand. And one of these advantages that makers have when we're dealing with designs is that we can make things in the same way that they're going to be manufactured. So 3D modeling, rapid prototyping, all those sort of technologies are fantastic, and they make the design process much more nimble. This piece here is completely made by hand, so it's not as exact as a 3D model. But that's the good part, right? So we're actually mimicking the same processes, and when we deliver this item to the factory, it's not only a proof of concept, but it's also proof that the piece can be made using the same techniques that they will be using. We can also fail really fast. So the glass shop in my mind is a giant maker bot, and we are all sort of analog rapid prototypers. And we can make these pieces within 10 minutes to an hour, depending on the size and scale. So it allows us to be very nimble, and we can work through many different iterations of the design before we find the one that's going to work. So these are examples of just a lot of failures. But the good news is I was able to work through these failures within about a month and a half. And all of that information, all of that process gets translated directly to the factory workers. This factory is actually in Turkey. And Holmegaard works with factories in Poland, the Czech Republic, and Turkey. So a factory, in my mind, is a living, breathing entity, right? And it relies on this balance of power between the workers and the management. And that sort of balance of power is analogous to the state of affairs in that country that it's situated in. So we need to be really careful about where we have things manufactured, and we have to avoid places where working conditions are suspect. So the Urania is essentially a acoustic amplifier. And this next project deals with the selfie stick phenomenon. So for me, this illustrates the fact that design can be really fun, and it can be used to express an idea. This is the first time I've actually shown this work, and it's in collaboration with my partner Justin Crow, who's a fantastic ceramic artist. So this piece functions as a selfie stick, but it also functions as a mental driver to kind of question our constant need for validation on the internet and the narcissistic tendencies that starts to cultivate. And I'm glad you're laughing. It's definitely supposed to be funny. Right now, this piece isn't necessarily meant for production. But in my mind, the way we classify things according to where we are in the design process, whether it's model, concept, prototype, or product, is really interesting to me. And I see the design concept as the embodiment of an idea. And by changing the context of that work, where it is seen or shown or used, we can change the meaning of the work. And that's where design becomes art and art becomes design. The Hourglass. So to me, the Hourglass is arguably one of the first pieces that absolutely had to be made out of glass. Can you imagine having a ceramic hourglass, right? How long have we been here? I don't know. Can you hear anything? I can't hear anything. We better check the sundial, I mean, it's the perfect sort of marriage of material and function. This project started as a design challenge to make an object that will actually get people to put their phones down for 15 minutes, to sort of reflect on time and to relax. So, if art depends on craft and craft depends only on itself, what about design? So I think that design is a combination of art and craft that has had constraints applied to the process. So this would have never happened without that sort of design brief, to sort of take one of those variables out of everything and just give a little bit of direction. Traditionally, the hourglass operates in a linear fashion, right? Straight up and down, or you can rest it on its side to kind of stop the clock. However, we now know that time is not linear or absolute, but it's relative. And regardless of how much time is not understood, we remain determined to measure it as accurately as possible, right? So even though we don't really understand it, we try and measure it. And we've done a really good job of that. But to me, this is ridiculous, and to me, this is sort of like inventing a metronome without understanding what music is. So I wanted to visualize that lack of knowledge. And although this hourglass does precisely measure time when in its full vertical orientation, the viewer can manipulate the angle and the axis of the artifact, speeding up or slowing down the measurement of time. And this device becomes a symbol. It's a method to contemplate the idea of time rather than trying to measure it accurately. And this is handmade out of borosilicate glass. So slow things down, take a minute, and in this case, however long that minute takes, and sort of reflect. Now, as glass artists and glass makers and glass designers, we get asked a lot to justify why we use glass, and perhaps it's because of its seductive nature and its widespread appeal. And the responses you will hear usually have something to do with its optical properties, or its fragility, or its ability to evoke nostalgia. And a lot of glass artists will claim that they are artists who use the material of glass only when it serves their idea. But it just so happens that they've only ever used glass. And I don't think that we need to make up reasons to use glass. I think that the reason we use glass is simply because it's the material we've been trained how to use. Whether that's in a material-specific program or in a factory. And because of this, it's the material that we think through. So I think that if we give our students and ourselves the freedom to think through the material in every context, whether it's art, craft, or design, great things are bound to happen. Thank you.